I only recently finished playing my first Final Fantasy game, and it was Final Fantasy X. What a game. I've missed out on this beautiful, engaging story for 20 years, and it's all because of this stupid prejudice I've held against turn-based combat for most of my life. Thanks to the recommendations of my girlfriend, however, I've been slowly taking in games with turn-based combat and enjoying them immensely. I'm glad that Final Fantasy X was the first game I played in trying to break through this prejudice because the story and world has this genius amalgamation of religious myths. Given that my YouTube channel centers around religious concepts and their influence on our favorite stories, you can imagine how much of a joy it was for me to play this game. A good example of FFX's roots in human religion is the names of the Aeons. Ifrit, or Ifrit, is a demon from Islamic mythology, formed out of smoke and fire, which obviously goes well with Ifrit's appearance. Ixion was the son of Ares from Greek mythology, who lusted after Hera, the wife of Zeus, and was thus struck with a thunderbolt. This of course works harmoniously with the Aeon's lightning powers. As for the name Aeon itself, that is a word that is deeply important to something called Gnosticism. At first, I merely thought it was a simple reference, but the more I played the game, the more I realized that the entire world of Final Fantasy X might be predicated on Gnostic concepts. Not only that, Gnosticism might help explain certain outstanding mysteries about how the world of FFX functions. Before I can explain these connections, I need to lay out what Gnosticism is for newcomers, as well as the Gnostic concept of Aeons. I will start with a definition of Gnosticism. The simplest definition I can give, unfortunately, comes from Wikipedia. This is the only time I will cite this website, I promise. Gnosticism is a collection of religious ideas and systems which originated in the late 1st century AD among Jewish and early Christian sects. These various groups emphasized personal spiritual knowledge, gnosis, over the orthodox teachings, traditions, and authority of the Church. To put it even more simply, the beliefs of the Gnostics were a combination of Judeo-Christian doctrine and psychological insight. A good example of this is found in the concept of Aeons. In Gnosticism, the Aeons were thought to be emanations of the one true God, products of God's mind. According to GnosticismExplained.org, some say that God's infinite abundance of thought overflowed and crystallized as new entities. These entities were the Aeons. In the Valentinian system, there are 15 pairs of Aeons, making a total of 30. Now these 30 Aeons made up a sphere of existence known as the Pleroma. If you want a basic understanding of the Pleroma, you could get away with calling it heaven. It's the place that the one true God and all his emanations reside, and it is the place that we wish to travel to upon death. For the purposes of this video, there are two extra things you should keep in mind about the Pleroma. First of all, the Pleroma isn't a physical plane of existence. It is actually an immaterial realm, one that borders our material realm. A good way of thinking about it is like the mind and body. Your body has a material, tangible form, but your mind doesn't. Nonetheless, the mind contains thoughts, dreams, memories, and instincts. They are without form, but nonetheless are real. In this case, the Pleroma is the mind of God. The second thing you need to know is that the Gnostics sought the Pleroma from within. Human beings share a connection to the Pleroma through their minds, and they attain the Pleroma through, as I said before, gnosis. Quote, "The Pleroma's fullness was also an internal spiritual state of being that was accessible in this life through direct experience. The Gnostic Gospel of Philip says, what is innermost in a person is the fullness, Pleroma, and there is nothing further within." And this is what they call the uppermost. Seeing that Christians believed humans were created in the image of God, it makes sense that the Gnostics would take that theme and expand upon it. In this specific case, humans are a reflection of their God because they too have minds. And the imaginative function of our minds reflects the imaginative function of the Pleroma. As above, so below. Before I can move back to Final Fantasy X, I need to discuss one last thing regarding the Pleroma. It is from this immaterial realm that everything in our material universe comes from. When God thinks of something, that thought emanates from the pleroma into our material realm in all its various forms. For example, if God were to think of mother, or planet, or vegetable, then that thought would take on its trillions of variations throughout the universe. The pleroma is depicted as being much like the world of the forms in Plato's thought, an ideal, unchanging, eternal realm of which the material world is a corrupted, inferior copy. In the pleroma, God's thoughts, God's aeons, are in a state of unified perfection. They are all forms at once, timeless and unchanging. It is only when those thoughts go out into the material realm that they are divided into their various forms. To recap, the heavenly pleroma is the immaterial realm of God. It is God's mind, and human beings share a connection to the pleroma through their own minds. God's thoughts leave the pleroma and take physical form in the material universe. If we take this knowledge and apply it to Final Fantasy X, several connections start to manifest. First of all, what is an Aeon in Final Fantasy X? They are the physical realization of the Faith's dreams. As we know from the game, the Faith are former human beings who had their souls sealed into statues. These souls exist in a state of perpetual dreaming, so that when a summoner like Yuna comes along, she can use the power of the Fireflies to give form to the Faith's dream, their Aeon. Just like the Aeons of Gnosticism are the products of God's mind, the Aeons in Final Fantasy X are products of the minds of the Faith. The universe of FFX posits that the minds of humans, or former humans in this case, have the same procreative power as that of the one true God in Gnosticism. This is evidenced by the function of the Fireflies. To understand what the Fireflies truly are and what their function is, I think it's best to view them as fallen pieces of the bright heavenly pleroma. Pieces that wander the physical world, either waiting to take form, be sent to the far plane, or possibly return to the pleroma, that is, if my perceptions are correct. Whether they be souls that have yet to be sent to the far plane, or are pieces of the environment surrounding them, they are all pieces of God's mind that have exited the pleroma and are waiting to take on a physical form. They are pieces of pure potentiality, whose ultimate form depends on whether or not another living being interacts with them, as well as how another living being interacts with them. Again, in the case of the Aeons, summoners use them to give form to the dreams of the Faith. Waka uses them to give an ethereal form to his brother Chapu, and Yu Yevon uses them to create Sin. We'll get to Sin, because with Sin, we might have another Gnostic reference, but let's return to Gnostic mythology for a moment. The Gnostics gave the pleroma a unique structure, one that differed from their Orthodox contemporaries and their conception of heaven. The 30 Aeons you see displayed here, as I said, were products of God's mind. God, obviously, rests at the top of the heavenly hierarchy, and each successive pairing fell further and further from the top of heaven down towards the material realm. At the very bottom of the list is the Theletis-Sophia pairing. Sophia was known as the wisdom of God. Sophia is a very important Aeon to the history of Gnosticism. Because Sophia was at the very bottom of the heavenly pleroma, she could peer across the borders of heaven into the material realm. Sophia was drawn to the material realm, but the actual reason for why this happened differs. Some say she wanted to act alone without her masculine consort, some say she was tricked into going there. Whatever the case may be, she fell out of the pleroma, and her presence in the material realm allowed her to birth material beings. Once again, God's thought giving form to things in the material realm. This, of course, reflects the function of the Fireflies, who seem to be pieces of the heavenly pleroma that are drawn to the thoughts of others. Now, of Sophia's creations in the history of Gnosticism, the most famous would definitely be the creature known as the demiurge. The demiurge, generally speaking, is seen by the Gnostics as the god who created and rules over Earth. To some, the demiurge was the god of the Old Testament in the Bible. The reasons for this association are pretty complicated, but if I were to simplify, the Gnostics wanted to explain why the God of the Old Testament was so different from the God of the New Testament. The God of the New Testament is often seen as a loving God, whereas the God of the Old Testament tends to act in jealous, destructive ways, even by that God's own admission. The Gnostics wanted to explain God's destructive ways, and in doing so, they invented the idea of a demiurge who was ignorant of his origin from Sophia or the existence of a heavenly pleroma. Thus, as an imperfect God in an imperfect realm, he installed his imperfect rule. And it is due to that imperfection that we not only get the destroying God of the Old Testament, but we also get an imperfect world full of suffering. It was the mission of the Gnostics to bring this knowledge to the rest of the world so that they could transcend this world and reunite with the Pleroma. With that said, I could not help but notice that the creature known as sin and its supposed purpose in the land of Spira reflects that of the demiurge. Let's go over the evidence. As we know from the game, there was a summoner named Yevon who lived in a city called Zanarkand around 1000 years ago. During his time, there was a war between Zanarkand and the city of Bavel. Bavel relied on machina, or technology, to build weapons for their offensive effort, and Zanarkand used summoners and their magic for their offensive effort. Zanarkand was on the brink of loss when Yevon devised a plan. He called forth the remaining people of Zanarkand, removed the souls from their bodies, and placed them into statues which would rest on Mount Gagazet. The purpose of this was to keep these souls in a perpetual state of dreaming about Zanarkand. It was the collective effort of these souls dreaming, plus the use of fireflies, that enabled Yevon to manifest a dream version of Zanarkand, way out in the waters of Spira, away from anybody else, especially the influence of those sympathetic to Machina. In order to prevent anybody from discovering this dream version of Zanarkand, Yevon called fireflies to himself and used them to create sin. The purpose of sin was not only to protect Dream Zanarkand, but also to destroy any civilization that grew too large or relied too heavily on Machina. Unfortunately, Yevon would lose control over sin. The mental link they shared became too tenuous, causing Yevon to fall into insanity and sin to become an unconscious, indiscriminate force of nature, attacking anything and everything, a state that reflects that of the Gnostic demiurge. To make sense of this horrific beast, the denizens of Spira concluded that sin lived off of the bad deeds of the people of Spira. If people atoned for their sins and lived moral lives, then the beast, sin, would cease to exist. But until that happened, they would continue to suffer. Sure, there was the brief respite known as the calm, where a summoner would bring about the final Aeon and make sin disappear for a while, but nonetheless, sin would return, and the cycle of life, death, and rebirth would continue without cessation. Just like with the cult of the Gnostics, there was only a select few people that would find out the truth about how the world really functioned, who sin truly was, and it only occurred after a long, arduous period of gnosis. The rule of an imperfect demiurge who maintains the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and infuses it with all its suffering, is clearly reflected in Final Fantasy X. On top of this, there are games that not only borrow the demiurge concept, but also craft a story about overthrowing the demiurge's rule. The best example of a game borrowing the demiurge concept would have to be the Legacy of Kain series. The character known as the Elder God rules over the land of Nosgoth, and wishes to maintain its cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The characters of Raziel and Kain wish to overthrow it. The Dark Souls games also have a demiurge-like character in Gwyn, a man who is actively thwarting the interests of mankind while also proclaiming his false status as the one true god, just like the demiurge does. Deus Ex makes brief reference to this concept as well. One of the login names that you can input into a terminal in that game is Demiurge. This is appropriate because the US government in that game is an all-encompassing demiurge-like force, and the character known as J.C. Denton is looking to overthrow it. The character of Sin, and by extension Yevon, are just a continuation of the same ancient concept. The denizens of Spira feel they need to satiate this god in order to achieve salvation, just like the Old Testament god needed to be satiated. But only a select few knew the truth about this false god, and it was the knowledge that that select few possessed that would truly usher in salvation. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a like if you haven't already. When you hit the like button, it tells the YouTube algorithm that not only this video, but all the other content on my channel is worth watching. If you like this video, then you might want to click on either of the two videos you see on screen now. And of course, if you want to see more videos like this where I investigate the inspirations and mysteries of video games, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, stay yellow.